On May 7, 364 CE, church leaders convened at the Council of Laodicea in what is now western Turkey. Among the 60 canons they produced that day, one was unusually brief, a list of books considered appropriate for Christian reading. The Book of Enoch was not on it. No explanation was entered into the council record for its exclusion. The canon was simply closed, and Enoch was simply not inside it. For the next 17 centuries, that absence shaped the theological landscape of Western Christianity. A text that had circulated among Jewish communities for centuries before Christ, that had been quoted directly inside the accepted New Testament canon by the Book of Jude, and that had been copied 11 times among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, more than Exodus, more than Deuteronomy, disappeared from Western Christianity as completely as if it had never existed. The question this documentary examines is deceptively simple. Why? The answer, when you follow the manuscript record honestly and look carefully at who opposed the text, what they opposed about it, and when their opposition intensified, is more specific and more interesting than the simple word unsuitable that church leaders attached to the decision. Before we go further, subscribe now if this kind of textual and historical exploration is what you are here for. Every week this channel examines ancient texts, scholarly debates, and interpretive questions at the edges of mainstream scholarship. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The text that should not have survived. The oldest surviving fragments of the Book of Enoch are not medieval copies. They are Aramaic parchment strips from Qumran Cave 4, designated 4Q201 through 4Q212, dated by paleography to between 200 and 100 BCE. They are held at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem, older than any surviving New Testament manuscript by at least a century. The Greek Akhmim fragment was recovered from an Egyptian tomb in 1886 by French archaeologists and is now catalogued at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts, preserved continuously by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church across more than a millennium, represent the most complete surviving text and were brought to European attention in 1773 by the Scottish explorer James Bruce. 3 copies carried out of Ethiopia and deposited at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where they remain. 3 independent manuscript traditions, 3 separate languages, 3 separate preservation chains that never intersected, the same content in all 3. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, whose 2001 Hermenia commentary for Fortress Press is the definitive contemporary scholarly reference on First Enoch, has been direct in published work about what this convergence means. The core content of the Book of Enoch is among the most textually stable documents in the entire Jewish and early Christian literary record. It was not corrupted in transmission, it was not significantly altered across the traditions, it was copied repeatedly and carefully by communities who considered it important enough to preserve with precision. And then one community excluded it, and that exclusion spread across most of Western Christianity for 1700 years. What Enoch actually contains that created problems? Before examining the exclusion, it is worth being precise about what the text actually contains, because the mainstream popular characterization of Enoch as a fringe text about fallen angels significantly undersells what is actually in it, and why institutional Christianity found it difficult. The Book of Enoch is not one book. It is a collection of 5 distinct compositions preserved together: the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Each has a distinct character, a distinct compositional history, and, relevantly, distinct theological claims that created different kinds of friction with developing Orthodox Christianity. The Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36, contains the most cosmologically specific material in the entire ancient Jewish textual record outside the canonical texts. It describes a structured heaven with distinct regions and distinct populations, a structured afterlife with 4 holding chambers in chapter 22, a prison for fallen beings at the ends of the earth in chapters 18 through 19, and a throne room in chapter 14, whose physical description is among the oldest surviving examples of the theological approach that later scholars would call the via negativa, describing God by negation rather than positive attribute. Michael Knibb of King's College London, in his 1978 Oxford Critical Edition, noted that the throne room description represents a sophisticated theological position that was unlikely to have been generated after the canonical texts rather than before them. The Astronomical Book, chapters 72 through 82, contains computational astronomical tables for solar and lunar movements, whose precision, as Nickelsburg noted in published work, is unusual for a religious composition and is more consistent with observational record-keeping than with theological invention. The Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, contains what scholars identify as explicit social critique, directed at institutional wealth and its relationship to religious authority, critique formulated with sufficient structural care that Vanderkam, in his published work, characterized it as a deliberate compositional argument rather than prophetic generality. These are the things the text contains, not a single thing: a structured cosmology, a detailed afterlife architecture, astronomical computation, a critique of institutional wealth, and a claim about the origin of evil that differed significantly from the framework that became dominant in Orthodox Christianity. Who opposed it and when? The opposition to Enoch in early Christianity is documented. What is also documented, and rarely discussed with precision, is when that opposition intensified and who was responsible for the specific arguments that made the exclusion permanent. Early Christianity is documented as having been comfortable with Enoch. Jude 1:14 quotes it directly without apology, and Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these, saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones." This is not a paraphrase. It is a direct quotation from 1 Enoch 1:9, rendered in Greek that aligns precisely with the Qumran Aramaic and the Ge'ez. The author of Jude considered Enoch authoritative enough to cite as prophetic scripture in a text that became canonical. Tertullian, the North African theologian writing at the end of the 2nd century, explicitly defended the Book of Enoch's authority in his work On the Apparel of Women. His defense is documented. He argued that the fact the text did not appear in the Hebrew Scriptures was not decisive against its authority because it predated the destruction of the temple and was preserved through Noah. Origen, the 3rd century Alexandrian scholar, engaged extensively with the Enochic material in his commentaries without rejecting it as incompatible with Christian teaching. The decisive shift came in the 4th century with Jerome and Augustine, two of the most influential theological minds in Western Christian history, and the architects, more than any council decision, of what Western Christianity would look like for the next millennium. Jerome, who produced the Latin Vulgate translation that became the standard text of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years, addressed Enoch explicitly in his preface to Genesis and in his commentary on the Epistle of Jude. He acknowledged that Jude quoted Enoch. He resolved the tension not by accepting Enoch's authority, but by arguing that Jude was merely citing a known text, not endorsing it as scripture. This reasoning is documented. Its purpose, as scholars of canon formation, including Nickelsburg and Vanderkam, have noted in published work, was to preserve Jude in the canon while removing the evidentiary basis for Enoch's authority. Augustine addressed the Enochic material in The City of God. His objections were specific and documented. He found the detailed afterlife architecture of chapter 22 incompatible with what he considered the simpler and more authoritative canonical account. He found the specific origin of evil in the Watcher narrative, a structured group with named members operating under a ranked hierarchy, incompatible with the developing Orthodox framework of a single figure's rebellion and fall. And he found the specific cosmological claims of the vision sequence in chapters 17 through 36 too spatial, too measurable, and too checkable against physical geography to be appropriate as religious content. These are not inferences. They are documented arguments in Augustine's published theological works. What the arguments were actually about. Nickelsburg, in his 2001 Hermeneia commentary, characterized the 4th century opposition to Enoch as having 3 distinct strands, and his characterization is worth examining carefully because it is documented in peer-reviewed scholarly work, not alternative research inference. The first strand was authorship. Enoch was attributed to a pre-flood figure for whom no parallel Hebrew textual authority existed. In the context of a developing canon that organized scriptural authority around prophetic succession within Israel's history, a pre-flood author without that lineage was structurally inconvenient. The second strand was cosmological specificity. The detailed, structured, geographically anchored cosmology of Enoch's vision sequence was inconsistent with the more abstract cosmological framework that was becoming dominant in theological synthesis. A heaven with 7 distinct regions, each with distinct physical properties, was not the heaven that Jerome and Augustine were building their theology around, not because they thought Enoch was describing something false, but because the specificity created problems. It implied a cosmological map that could, in principle, be evaluated against observable reality. The third strand was the social critique of the Epistle of Enoch. Chapters 94 through 105 contain some of the most direct condemnations of institutional wealth and its relationship to religious authority in any ancient Jewish or early Christian text. They are formulated not as general moral exhortation but as specific structural critique, directed at identifiable institutional patterns. As Nicholsburg noted, these chapters were difficult for an institutionalizing church not primarily because they were theologically incorrect, but because they were institutionally inconvenient. All three strands, individually, might have been manageable. Together, and in the context of a canonical process that required drawing firm lines, they made Enoch's exclusion the path of least institutional resistance. What the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved and why. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's continuous preservation of the Book of Enoch in its biblical canon is not a minor historical footnote. It is a documented case of an alternative canonical decision producing a different theological trajectory across more than 15 centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church recognizes a broader biblical canon than either Catholic or Protestant Christianity. Its canon includes 1st Enoch, 2nd Enoch in some recensions, the Book of Jubilees, and several other texts excluded from the Western canon. This broader canon is not a deviation from an original smaller canon. It reflects a different participation in the canon formation process of the 4th and 5th centuries. James Charlesworth of Princeton Theological Seminary, who edited the Old Testament pseudepigrapha series for which Isaac produced the Enoch translation, has argued in published work that the Ethiopian canonical tradition represents a genuine alternative window into the diversity of Second Temple Jewish and early Christian textual culture, one that Western Christianity effectively closed when it excluded Enoch and related texts. Vanderkam has noted in published work that the Ethiopian Orthodox liturgical and theological tradition shows evidence of more sustained engagement with the Enochic cosmological framework than Western Christianity, that the seven-heaven structure, the four-chamber afterlife architecture, and the watcher hierarchy remained more present as theological concepts in the Ethiopian tradition than they became in Western Christian theology after the exclusion. This is documented in mainstream Enoch scholarship. It means that the exclusion of Enoch was not simply the exclusion of one text among many, it was the exclusion of a cosmological framework, and the preservation of that framework by a different canonical tradition shows what Western Christianity looked like before the lines were drawn. What Qumran showed that could not be undismissed. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovery of 1947 created a problem for the standard account of Enoch's exclusion, and it is worth stating what that problem is precisely. 11 copies of Enoch at Qumran. Among the most copied texts in the collection, besides Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. The community at Qumran, whose relationship to mainstream Second Temple Judaism is itself debated, considered Enoch important enough to copy repeatedly. This was not a fringe community's fringe document. It was a central text in a tradition that was itself central to the textual world that gave rise to Christianity. The Qumran Enoch material was not immediately published after its discovery. Joseph Milik, the Polish Jesuit scholar assigned to the Cave 4 fragments, did not produce his critical edition until 1976, nearly 3 decades after the discovery. During that period, access to the fragments was restricted to the team assigned to them. Scholars who requested access and were denied included, on documented record, John Strugnell and others who have written about the access restrictions in published work. Whether the publication delay was motivated by the content of the fragments or by the scale, complexity, and resource constraints of the broader Scrolls publication project is a question that scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls continue to discuss. Publication delays affected many portions of the Scrolls. Whether the Enoch material was disproportionately delayed relative to its significance is a legitimate scholarly question without a settled answer. What the eventual publication showed was this: the Enoch tradition in the Qumran Aramaic fragments is not a later development of earlier, simpler traditions. In some cases, the Aramaic fragments are more detailed, not less, than the Ge'ez manuscripts. The tradition was old, stable, and carefully maintained by communities that considered it important. That finding complicated the account of Enoch as an eccentric later composition. It did not resolve the question of what the text describes or whether its claims are true, but it made the historical narrative of Enoch as a marginal text significantly harder to sustain. What is established and what is not? What can be independently verified? The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE is documented history. The Qumran Enoch fragments 4Q201 through 4Q212 are real and dated. The Akhmim Greek fragment is real. The Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts are real. Jude 1:14 directly quotes 1 Enoch 1:9. This is documented in biblical scholarship. Tertullian's defense of Enoch is documented. Jerome's and Augustine's documented opposition arguments are verifiable in their surviving theological works. Nicolsburg's three-strand characterization of the opposition is published in his 2001 commentary. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon includes Enoch. This is documented. The Milik publication delay is a documented historical fact discussed in the scholarly literature. Charlesworth's argument about the Ethiopian canonical tradition is published in peer-reviewed work. What remains debated within mainstream scholarship, whether the opposition to Enoch was primarily motivated by authorship concerns, cosmological specificity, or social critique, or by some combination of the three in different proportions for different figures. Whether the Milik publication delay reflected content-motivated restriction or logistical and resource constraints, whether the Ethiopian canonical tradition represents an authentic preservation of early Christian textual diversity or a distinct regional tradition that developed separately. What this documentary does not endorse, any claim that the Book of Enoch is literally true as a cosmological or historical description, any claim that the Church's canonical decisions were deliberately fraudulent, any claim that the exclusion was part of a conspiracy rather than an institutional process with documented participants and documented arguments. What is worth holding on to? The Book of Enoch was removed from the biblical canon at a specific council meeting on a specific date by people with specific documented objections, whose arguments are preserved in their surviving writings. The text they excluded is available, has been since 1773 in European collections, and since 1947 in its Aramaic form at Qumran. The scholars who have worked on it across the last century have produced a body of published, peer-reviewed work that is accessible to anyone who looks for it. What is worth holding on to is not a conclusion about whether Enoch was right or wrong, or whether the Church made the correct decision in excluding it. What is worth holding on to is the precision of the historical question. A specific text, with specific content, was excluded by specific people with specific documented reasons, and an alternative tradition preserved it across the same period and produced a different theological landscape as a result. That is a historical fact worth knowing. What it means is a question that the text and the scholarship together raise without resolving.